conversations about race can be pretty taboo, and I think we tend to shy away from it just as a community or as people. But it's very imperative for us just to have these conversations, especially during these challenging times right now. We've witnessed as a society just the loss of lives of unarmed African Americans, of George Floyd just this past May, of Breonna Taylor in March, Ahmaud Arbery just in February. And it's really difficult just to sit in silence and to see these things happening over and over again. And for me, why it's so moving is like I know I have a young 2-year-old, like African American son that I'm going to have to raise here in America. And I think it's imperative for us to examine the race relations here within our society and just to have spaces to talk about it because it's not.
Okay. Still don't hear her. Let's see.
I'm
No,
sorry.
I'm on this kind of stuff all day, so my volume's fine.
But I want us just to be aware that it's time for us just to examine these race relations here within our society and to know that they're deeply rooted. So these things just didn't occur overnight. Like they've been here, just part of our American history for so long. And I know that we won't have time in this 1 hour webinar to go into full details of the connections. But I think it's very important for us to know that WCC offers SOCH 205. So it's a class in race and ethnic relations, just for you to learn more about the historical context of race. And then from a history standpoint, we also offer History 150, which gives more about African American history and the contributions of African Americans to American history. So we can begin the PowerPoint here. Let me just make sure it's set up here. Oops. And I want to start the conversation by just looking at this quote here. And I may mute myself and unmute myself throughout the presentation, just so you're aware, just my video. Oops, slide this over here. Sorry, just move this out of the way. Yeah, but I want us just to take a second to see this quote here, which talks about how we can't move forward without talking to people. And I really want to recognize just the significance of dialogue, because dialogue is so critical for us. And this quote is from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, which I'm going to reference a lot of her work throughout the PowerPoint today as we start this conversation about race. And just having conversations is such a powerful word for us because talk, it's not something that comes easy. And by itself, it's not sufficient. And we have to have these conversations for us to be in a position to actually make change or to inspire us to a place to do some type of action. We're going to spend today just being able to define race and racism and just spend some time discussing the issues we have with discussing race. And then spend the last part of the section or the session today just figuring out some strategies about how we can increase our understanding of starting these conversations and then propelling ourselves into a space of action. And to start, it's important for us to just notice these ground rules, which knowing I'm a mental health therapist and I've run therapy groups and just other shared spaces, I think it's good for us to have a foundational understanding of just some general ground rules. So the first is just safety. So it's very important for us to have a sense of safety when we talk about race. And we have to recognize that discussing race is not easy for everyone. knowing that some of us could have very painful experiences tied to our racial identity. And there's a whole field devoted to racial trauma and just the stress people experience due to their skin color. So it's good for us to acknowledge that we have to respect people's autonomy with how much they're willing to share and not share, and know that some conversations can be quite triggering. And next is just responsibility. So it's important for each of us just to take responsibility for our own learning. And by doing this, we can use I statements. So being able to not speak for all people or speak for others, but just use I statements as you describe more about your experiences or what you're noticing. And another thing is just not to expect another person to teach you about the race. Like, it's good for us to give people the option, but not to make them feel inclined that they have to teach you about themselves. Next is just respect. So this is the key for any space. It's just for us to have this sense of respect. And it's important for us to just be aware and to treat one another in a polite and kind way. And then lastly, it's just interactive. So I know it's kind of hard from a virtual standpoint, but my teaching style is something I can describe a little bit about, where I really value the fact that we are all vessels for our own knowledge. And I don't like to be looked at as on this pedestal and then my students down here, because we can all use this space just to exchange ideas and just to collaborate, because we all have our own set of experiences and expertise. So I really encourage you to speak up by just unmuting yourself or using the chat box, and make sure you can locate the chat box in this GoToMeeting setting. But I want to open it up with just having an open discussion for us, just to kind of segue into what we're going to learn about today. And one question, or just something that I hear a lot, and it's just, can we really live in a colorblind society? And some statements that you may have heard to represent this colorblindness is, oh, I don't see color, or there's only one race, the human race, or people are people, like I don't see race, or I don't see you as Black, I see you as just a person like me. And I want to open it up for us just to talk about this idea, and can we really live in a colorblind world?
Um, did you want an answer to that?
Yeah, I want us to have a dialogue. This is the space for us just to talk about that, and I want to hear your thoughts. And
Okay,
there's no wrong answer, so it's more just for you to speak freely.
okay.
And you do that.
I'm,
Go ahead.
pardon?
You
Can you
can
hear?
share your, like,
Okay, I'm a retired social worker. I was a social worker for 45 years, okay? And I used to think that a goal would be to have a colorblind society. I'm not so sure that that should really be the goal, because I'm thinking more of recognizing that there are many differences that we have. Skin color may be one of them, but we shouldn't be judging people based on that. But do we really want everybody to be all the same? That's what and I'll be
no,
quiet.
no, I appreciate you sharing this, and it also sharing more, because I'm sure a lot of people have thought we shouldn't, that we should just assimilate in that way.
So we have a
And
comment from someone in the chat.
oh yeah,
When you say that, I think you miss out on the opportunity to meet people and the essence of who they are. Celebrate the difference.
yeah, absolutely. So it's really important for us just to recognize that we've all been taught to
There you go.
not see color, or
You
many
too.
of us
Thank you.
color. So
Oh,
it's important that when we are taught this, it really perpetuates or reproduces this covert sense of racial inequality. So having the space just to speak openly about race and to know that it's not really conducive for us society because
Hi, this is Tracy. I just wanted to also uplift the fact that I know that that was probably what the initial thoughts were a few decades ago. But the more we learned and evolved at celebrating differences, when we don't look at color, we marginalize different groups of people. Where when we do recognize that students are whatever color, black, brown, a boy, girl. When we do see them, we're able to also see who they are, what their cultural experiences are, and we can also get literacy to match what they look like. So their narratives can be heard through the voices of people that they can connect with. So that makes us a little bit more aware that if I have a classroom with 50% or 60% of my students that are black or brown, I need to have literature that supports that particular group of students. And to be colorblind is to say, I'm just going to teach with the lens of whatever our American society has been doing for the last 100 or so years. And that's been through the lens of white perspective. So now we get to look at, okay, who is in our, I guess, in our reach that we can make these connections with. And that's why it's important to move away from being colorblind to saying, hey, I see you, I recognize you. Let me learn a little bit more about your culture so that I can bring things to make connections to your learning and move away from this cookie cutter one size fits all.
no, absolutely. And I really appreciate you sharing that just from your perspective. Just, it sounds like you're an educator and just the power of being able to embrace and take the time to learn more about different cultures or identities.
We have a
Because-
couple from the chat.
Yeah, I was wanting to just say, Tracy, that I really liked how, your connection to literacy, and it made me think about if we're even asking the right question. Can we live in a colorful society? Can we live in a society that, how do we make that shift? Because, even our language, just in this question, puts us down the old path. And I'm just wondering, I think it's going to take, like, as you were making a point about literacy, we need to really look at our language because it's embedded. Racism is embedded in just the very word colorblind. I don't like that word. So
I think I think that was the point of the question. I think to kind of get that out there and kick it off. But
oh, good.
to add to what Tracy said too, I think having a colorblind society, then the people who are saying that are the people like myself that are in the dominant culture. We're saying let's just be a colorblind society because then we just want everybody, and I think Christina used the word assimilate. We want everybody to assimilate to the dominant culture, and then we'll be all right. And I think that's the wrong attitude to take. So.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate just your take on it. And you can even notice how language evolves, so just how things evolve throughout our history. And the point is, like you said, we're trying to get away from this idea of color blindness because it doesn't really serve us in this day. And people can't erase their skin color. And we still have to put into context the historical relationship to where these deeply rooted issues revolving race, where do they come from? Before we can get to a position of healing and moving forward. And just for the first half of the 20th century, it was perfectly legal to deny Blacks or other racial minorities to access to housing, jobs, voting, or other explicit rights just based solely on the color of your skin. And we have seen movements just to push us away, like the civil rights movement helped to reform this and to recognize that these practices were illegal. And it wasn't too long in our history, but these systems of racism, they still persist. And they operate and more covert measures from a social, economic, or even institutional lens. So moving away from color blindness can really serve a purpose and put us on the path towards being anti-racist or being or not perpetuating this ideology. And there have been many hopes for us just to move from this post-racial society. But these current events are teaching us that it's bringing to light to a much different reality, that this is something that's right in front of our face. And I like how each of you are acknowledging that there's so much power and there's so much diversity in humans, and it's something that we need to embrace and we shouldn't ignore it. And I like the quote of just for us to embrace this colorful society, and even to maybe coin that phrase for us to be in that space to embrace diversity. And I want to move on to, so this kind of segues us into our next activity, where this is going to require just some self-reflection on your own part as you come to terms with your own racial identity. So I want everyone just to take a moment to think about your earliest race-related memory, like when you were aware of your race. And you don't have to share what that memory was with anyone here, but I just want you to think back, take a moment to self-reflect. And I hope everyone was able to just generate at least one memory. And I now want you to think about how old were you when this experience happened to you? And you're more than welcome to type in the chat box if you like, the age. You don't have to share the memory, but just type the age, how old you were.
Christina, where's the chat box?
You should see like a little bubble next to, maybe your screen looks a little bit different, but it should be a little bubble somewhere next to the attendees.
It's top right.
Okay, thank you.
Top right.
Looks like a thought bubble or a speech bubble.
Gotcha. It says 27, has a number? Yes, okay. All right, and we just type in a box somewhere?
Yep, so you can go ahead and just share.
Oh, I see my box. Okay.
No, and I'm then just scanning through here just to see the ages that are coming up for individuals. And I definitely see variations of as young as 2 or 3, younger than 5, and a lot of older ones. So maybe like as a teenager or in your 20s or 30s. No, so I appreciate each of you just taking the time just to reflect on this. And as you think about this experience, you don't have to share or disclose it, but what emotions are really coming up in you as you think about this memory? And you're more than welcome just to type it in the chat box. You don't have to share the memory, but just what emotions come up in you when you think about that memory. And keep in mind that these emotions can be neutral, they can be positive, they can be negative. And the way our brain works is our emotion center, our limbic system, our amygdala is so close to our memory center, our hippocampus. So we're more likely to remember these events that are more emotionally charged. So I really appreciate each of you just disclosing what it was like emotionally for you, whether it was positive, negative, neutral, or the actual emotion. And then I guess I can kind of get a sense of, was this memory uncomfortable for you in some way? And you can share if it was a yes or no or neutral. Mhm. Yes, I'm definitely seeing variations in probably more yeses in response to the fact that this memory was pretty uncomfortable for us as we reflect on a memory related to our race. And as you reflect on this particular memory, think about if this is something that you spoke up about, especially those of you who were younger, like under the age of 10 when this experience happened. Think about if you openly talked about these feelings that you had. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of majority no's as people just describe what it was like to experience this. Or I'm hearing not until years later when you had really time to digest it and process what that experience was. Or yes, I hear not having the words to articulate what that was. Mhm. But for those of you who can recall just the memories you've had, even if it did occur for you at such a young, pivotal, or a young point in your life, like under the age of 5, there's numerous studies that show that we, or there's a lot of studies to show, or let me back up a little bit just to say that when we think about those of you who talked about this experience of being so young, I want to get a sense of why we didn't speak up to an adult or speak up to another person about this. And if we look at kids primarily, kids are very candid. So if you've ever been around a kid who's under the age of 5, kids are likely just to point at people when they see differences or just to acknowledge something like the color of your skin. And the fact that some kids were silenced or told that it's not okay to talk about race, think about what effect that could have on how we develop. Because in your heart, you maybe knew that it was very uncomfortable. And for whatever reason, it's something that it's not okay to share, to talk openly about. So for some of us, we may have learned at an early age that we can't talk about race or racism. But there's been a lot of studies just to showcase the fact that a child who is between the age of 3 or 5, like they are already putting people into categories. Like they already have the capabilities of expressing any type of bias based on race. So it's good for us to acknowledge that this is something we cannot shy away from, and just to recognize that young children, they're going to draw their own conclusions about these differences. And adult silence can reinforce this colorblind rhetoric that tends to reinforce these race relations that we currently see. And then another thing, when children in particular are left to make sense of these differences, they tend to just draw their own conclusions about race. And in Dr. Tatum's book, she talked about just her own young son, about being in a preschool that was predominantly white. And the kids would ask, well, is your skin that color because you drank too much chocolate milk? Or I've heard other accounts, people describe their experience. Is your skin that color because you took too hot of a shower? Or you were out in the sun too long? Or is your skin this complexion because kids may equate it to dirt? So kids come up to their own devices when they're not giving space just to have these conversations. And if we learn at a young age that we're not good at talking, or we can't comfortably talk about race, then that sticks with us. So I think it's imperative for us to just increase our comfort, because our race and our identity, like, this is part of our identity and it's part of our American history.
So you're saying that we should, in terms of speaking with our children, is that what you're saying? Talk
Yeah,
about
I
race
think
to our children?
absolutely. I think it's important. Like, this is a system that we are all a part of. And of course, there's age appropriate ways to discuss race, but children as young as 3 or 5 are aware of these racial differences. And
Right.
there's tons of curriculum out there that I would be more than happy to share with you, but there's tons of curriculum out there just to teach, like, how do we teach kids about race?
Yeah. Because
Mhm.
I'm 65, and back then things are a lot, of course things are a lot different now
Mhm.
in terms of how, because back when I was young, and my parents, they never discussed race. I'm getting tongue tied. They never discussed race with us at all. And they both from the South, they came up to the North.
Mhm.
And on one occasion, I did ask my mother, and I was an adult then, how was the relationship? She was from Kentucky. How was the relationship for her and her family in Kentucky? I said, you guys must have got along great, right? Because you never talked about anything. And
Mhm.
her words were what she told me, I was just so shocked by the venom in her voice when she said, we hated those crackers.
Yeah.
And that, now I don't have, I live in a neighborhood now where my son goes, well, he went to, because he's grown now, he went
Mhm.
to a school that had, it was a diverse school. And so one day he came home from school. He was in the kindergarten, 5 years old, and he asked me, "Mom, am I white?"
Mm.
And and that was shocking to me as well. And that just goes to show that I hadn't had conversation with my child about race either. So it
Yeah,
was
absolutely.
yeah. So it was perpetuated. So it's
It's tough. I mean, it's not easy. It's really uncomfortable for us to talk about it. And we can recognize that it could be associated with painful memories and our own personal narratives and just our American history at that. So it's not something that's easy to talk about, but a way
yeah.
that we move forward is being able to talk about these things. And
Well,
I get how there can be some fear or just reservations or just not being comfortable or just not having the space to talk about it. So I get like how it can take practice on our part, or just researching the literature and the tools that are out there, knowing how we've evolved. And there's researchers studying how to have these conversations.
all right.
But what
Well,
are some other, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no,
Hmm.
I'm sorry. As he got older and started to go out into the world, of course, I had those conversations with him because
Hmm.
like I said, we were in a diverse neighborhood, so he had friends. He had a diverse set of friends, so he would always be with them. And I would say, look, I would always try to tell him to be careful because as a black male,
Hmm.
he had to be more careful to be
Absolutely.
around different people or diverse people. And if something happened, if the police were to stop them, then this is what I told him, you would probably be most likely to be
Mhm.
suspect. So I did
Yeah.
did pass that on to him, but that's only as an adult and just seeing the way the world is.
Absolutely. Yeah, and
Yeah.
you're bringing up a good point just about this overall system that we kind of breathe in this air to just be aware of these things from a social standpoint. And you're bringing up this idea of just racial socialization. Like, how do we prepare our children or prepare people to go into this world knowing that these systems exist? And I'm just hearing other people's perspectives. Like I said, it's a difficult conversation about race. It's difficult to talk about sex. Yeah, it is generally like a taboo topic. Like, it's not easy to talk about. And I get how we don't want to impose our ideas on children, but children come up with their own devices or their own conclusions about the world if we don't give them the space to talk about it. And then I see another point of just developing safe spaces is really crucial for all parties to have these discussions, which I hope is everyone is getting that sense right now from being able to talk freely and openly about race. So I appreciate you disclosing more about the difficulties and just even the timing of it when we do decide to have these conversations. So again, the question remains, like, can we really live in a colorblind society? No, like, we absolutely cannot continue
And
to
we don't
live.
want to. And we
Yeah,
don't
and we
want to.
don't want to. And no, we cannot, and we do not want to. So we have to continue to understand how we got here, because it didn't just happen overnight. And I want to just do a little background to talk more about race and racism, so defining these constructs. So when we hear the term race, race is a social construction. Like, there's no genetic or scientific basis to define this idea of race. It's societies that then establish and justify these systems of power, privilege, and oppression. But I can pretty much just look at someone and clump them into a category just based off the way they look. And we're well aware that we tend to associate a lot of experiences or the experiences of a person could lead to stark differences just basically solely how they look. And of course, these are just brief definitions of race and racism, but I still commend you to do your own independent studies to examine it further. And then one researcher defined racism as a system of advantage and disadvantage based on race. And racism, it's pervasive. It's a major part of our socialization just being here in the US. And it's important for us to recognize that, yes, we may not have such overt forms of racism as with such intensity, although we still see overt forms. We have to recognize more of these covert forms or more implicit forms of racism that could still affect how we experience the world. And just to open it up just briefly and just based off your own perspectives and what you've learned, so in what areas of life do we see these systems of racism impacting the lives of individuals?
Well, I just wanted to talk, I'm 65,
Mhm.
and growing up, I was born in the 50s in a suburb of Detroit. And racism, was, there was, it was segregated in our
Yeah,
town.
absolutely.
And it, and, there were constructs put in place. And like I was reading Christina's comment that she grew up in the 80s, being old, it's like, and getting this kind of infusion of racism, a systemic racism in my brain at such an early age. It's really like, I want to shift it. I remember when I was in high school, I fell in love with a black guy, but it was 1970, and this was like there was really a lot of racial tension. It was the latter 60s. It was probably 60, 69. And there was the race riots in Detroit in 67 or 68. It was like a lot of pressure there, and lot of taboos. And so I never said anything, nor did he. And because we knew it was not there's nowhere to go, and it was just and it's just we're living in such a time of you can't just like somebody for who they are. I grew up in that time. You can't like somebody for who they are. You have to like somebody that looks like you for who they are.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate you just sharing your experience though too. And it's important for us to recognize, like you said, the example you gave is not too far in our own history for you to
Yeah,
go through that.
it
And
was really a tough time. There were riots in my school, and
yeah.
there was no sports for girls in those days. There were no women's sports. The only thing you could do was cheerleading. And so I would go, and we would go to all these downriver schools. And I tell you, there would be nearly a race riot every time we went into the gymnasiums in Inkster, River Rouge. I mean, it was dangerous down there. It was like, it was just ready to erupt all the time.
Absolutely. No, and I appreciate each of you just adding in the chat box though too, how we see see it impacting pretty much all aspects of life. So regards to our education system, our health system, banking, the government, housing, jobs, healthcare. So pretty much all aspects of life are impacted, and we just breathe in and live this system with such intensity.
Can I just share a quick personal experience I just recently encountered? I received a letter in the mail. I have a Lexus vehicle, and it was a class action lawsuit letter. I had not filled out anything of that nature, so I almost threw it in the trash, thinking it was junk mail. Really quickly though, I read through it, and it was a class action lawsuit that I was privy to, included on, if you will. But come to find out, at the time, I had an excellent credit score. When I bought my vehicle, had no idea, but I was later sent a class action lawsuit check because Lexus Financial had been racially profiling their customers, and we were given much higher interest rates for even having excellent credit. I was still given a higher interest rate than my white counterparts, and it happened to African Americans as well as Asians. And that was the part of the lawsuit I had no idea of. And I'm a two-time Lexus vehicle owner, but that just really made me feel, oh my God, I can't explain how I felt because I was kind of a loyal member. That this will be my last Lexus vehicle. However, I would not have even known because that system is invisible. We don't know that someone else got a lower interest rate. I thought I got a good interest rate, but I still could have gotten an even lower one had I been checking the box that said Caucasian or whatever the case was.
Absolutely.
And so that is real and prevalent, and it's just happened recently.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that experience though too. And other people are bringing up, like even looking at our criminal justice system or looking at social media, like pretty much every aspect of our life is just, we live and breathe the system. And it's really up to us to figure out how we can really disrupt this system and dismantle the system just for the betterment of all people. And one question I like to ask is just when we meet someone for the first time, what do you think are the first things we notice about them? Like, do you think it's their hair color, their eye color, or do you think it's the shirt they're wearing, if they're wearing jeans, or whether they have a firm handshake? Like when we meet someone for the first time, the first two things that we note and take account of is their race and their gender of a person. And this information is just simply being gathered, And then it's handed off to the next brain region, which is processed. And we tend to pull out this information about what it means to be a man or woman, or to have this gender in our society, and what it means to belong, or what it means for a person to have a black face, or what it means for a person to be white or to have a white face. Like, we take in all this data and we pull up these associations that are all ingrained in our memory, like these systems of racism. And it's good for us to examine, like, what can we do? I know for me, it kind of puts you in a position of feeling helpless and hopeless and just wanting some change, as I just even explore more of the history of our country. But I recognize it's important for us to know how we can take an active role as an individual, but know that it's still going to take a collective effort from all of us to work together to disrupt the system of racism, and just to have these conversations and to take action. And we're going to just go over some examples or ways of how we can do this. And one is just for us to develop a healthy racial identity, and then for us to learn more about the system, and for us to be active and be intentional in how we connect and interact with others. So to start, we have to explore our racial identity. So in the US, this is a very racialized society, so everyone is assigned a racial identity whether they are aware of it or not. And our racial identity is externally imposed. So a question would be like, how do others perceive me? And then our racial identity is also internally constructed. Like, how do I identify myself? And as a psychology instructor, we learn a lot about development, identity development, from a social standpoint, an emotional standpoint, but there's really less emphasis on how we develop from a racial standpoint. And for us to know that our racial identity, it's fluid. It's a non-linear process. And it varies from person to person, from group to group. But we all have to do the work to make sense of our own identity. And I had the pleasure of working as a grad student with Dr. Janet Helms, who developed a racial identity model looking at white identity. And then William Cross, who provides context to the stages we go through for a person of color or an African American as we come into our racial identity. So I really recommend each of you to look into literature in regards to learning more about your racial identity. And next is just history. So I think one thing that's been really helpful for me is just knowing the context of things. Like, as you each are sharing your own experiences not too long ago of just the racial tension that we are dealing with now and what you've endured in your own lifetime, I think it's been very powerful for us to reach out and to recognize our own history and America's history, the good and the bad. And for me, I like to have discussions with my 92-year-old grandmother, who's pretty much been here for nearly a century. And it's just always fruitful or just reassuring just to get her take of life, and knowing that for me, it's just so emotional to go through these events. But it's just good to know, like, all that she's been through in just her lifetime. So I encourage you just to have conversations about your history with your loved ones or with others. And another thing to note is that non-white parents are about 3 times more likely to discuss race than white parents. And we talked a little bit about this idea of colorblindness. And for those who are in these non-majority groups or marginalized racial groups, we're more likely to send these messages, either implicitly or explicitly, about how to navigate this world, having your race. And we call that process racial socialization. So it's good for us to know that it's just so embedded in how we experience the world, like just this sense of the system of racism at that.
Uplift another point
Oh, go ahead. Yep. I'm sorry.
really quickly. The Golden Girls, there's a new meme going around, but it's actually relevant. It's a 30-year, it was 30 years ago. The Golden Girls is one of my favorite shows as well. But 30 years ago, there was a little conversation about the Confederate flag, and there was a black man that was on the show, Don Cheadle, and he was saying that, you know, let's not use this flag because it symbolizes something different to us. And what she shared, I can't remember if it was Blanche, I think it was Blanche, but what she shared was, well, this doesn't mean that, and that's not how I think. This flag represents my love of my family, and she brought up all these wonderful memories from her own legacy. But then, you know, it evolved. Of course, the show evolved, and it showed towards the end where she realized that he wasn't saying that she was the person that, you know, had those negative connotations behind it, but what it represented. And I think that's the uncomfortable portion. Our white counterparts think that it's an attack on them, or they kind of shy away from it because they don't know how to make it okay, because it is a part of a history that none of us like to look at. But because it is relevant, the show revealed that she was able to understand how he was expressing, how he perceived everything about that Confederate flag is negative for people of color. And so I think when you look at it in that sense, that was 30 years ago. And I don't even remember us even understanding and us being in a place where it was on deaf ears. But here we are 30 years later, and it's still, people still in my community where I live, still their Confederate license plates, and some people fly their flag on top of their pickup trucks. And we still look at that with pain in our hearts, even though they have that freedom, but it still is painful for us. And these could be our neighbors, but they don't understand. They think that they're representing their roots, but that their roots have such a painful stain on our history as Americans.
Absolutely. And it's important for us to familiarize ourselves with these past events and being able to recognize our past events and know that, yes, there's been a lot of atrocities of white individuals in our society, but there's also been white allies for us to have a good perspective of our history. So it's not all bad, but it's important for us to recognize that there is some heinous acts committed in our America that leads to a lot of emotional pain for people. And it's just modern manifestations of it that we see today.
I
So
wanted to
go ahead. Yep.
I wanted to share that your question about explore your racial history sort of triggered something in me, because I didn't realize I had a racial history.
Yeah, and that's a common misconception.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that I even had one. And then your comment about not talking about race, you know, it's so true, because I mean, I remember when my daughter was little, she was like, yeah, I've got lots of friends. And, you know, she just saw things entirely differently. And I just tried to be quiet, because I came from a time of such prejudice and from a family of prejudice. So, you know, you don't want to impart on your kids the things that weren't good about your past.
Yeah. But it's not helpful for us to sanitize our history because it still exists. And it's important for us to speak about it in an age appropriate way, of course, depending on who we're connecting with.
Yeah, it's tough. I think I went and bought books at I think the Uncommon bookstore or something about you know, and it was like about the many colors of people, and it was like lovely, and you know, anyways, because I was needing language, because I didn't
Absolutely.
have it. I wasn't instructed. So I had to find somebody that could talk the talk that gave a better message.
Yeah, and it's not easy, but we have the tools and resources now to access it and to just to learn more about how these systems work, the origins, to learn more about the injustice, learn more about inequality. Like there's so many good resources out there for us to do our own independent study. And then I think it's also crucial for us to be active in how we connect with others who are diverse from us. So even if you take a tally of how many friends do you have that are a part of a different racial ethnic background, or who's in your classrooms, or who are your employees, it's just good for us to take tally and make note of this and see if it's doing a disservice for whatever entity that we are a part of. Because we talked about there's so much power in being able to embrace diversity, and for us to really be active and being more observant in that, and for us to not be afraid to start conversations with others, whether it's, a lot of you gave examples of talking to your kids or talking to your family, talking to friends at work, at school, whatever systems that you are connected with. Like those are perfect opportunities just to explore race and racism in more detail and to be an active contributor, because we all have these embedded beliefs. It's like the air we breathe. We think about racism and the system's a part of it. So we really have to come together to dismantle it. And lastly, just starting conversations about race. So I guess today I received an email about a book club that's going to be coming up. And it's just good to know that this can occur virtually or just even with your friends or family, just having discussions. And I know for me, like with me, my partner, and my family, we've been able to watch more films and shows. Like I think we watched the Malcolm X series, or we watched the film Glory just recently, just watching films and just having discussions about them. Because that's like one way I like to learn more about and then do my own research. But it's important for us not to shy away from our history and like to lean into it, knowing that there's these mediums or ways for us to acknowledge our past. And I get how it can be very hurtful or painful to explore it, but we have to recognize our history and be able to persevere from it so that we don't continue to make the same mistakes or to ignore our history. Other ways can be like visiting museums, attending different festivals, or just different cultural celebrations. Like these are all ways for us to just be more immersed in this idea and just to embrace diversity. But to be mindful that we know that starting these conversations, they can be difficult and they can be very painful at that, knowing the emotions that are tied to it, the historical ties to it. So I commend you to really just do your own exploration and learning, and make sure it's okay if you want to just get the okay from the person that you're connecting with to talk more about race in a way. But it's not something that we need to shy away from because it's a big part of our identity. And a lot of the activity that we went over today was adapted from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, and her book talks, it's like a introduction to racism and racial identity. It's a very easy read that I recommend each of you take a chance to explore or look at if you haven't already read this book. But it just gives more insight about how we can have conversations of race and just like how we can take an active role in that. And then earlier I gave some examples of different racial identity models. So you're more than happy just to Google the Black Identity Model by William Cross, or the White Racial Identity Model by Dr. Janet Helms. And just for us to take the time for us to learn more about our own racial identity. I know we don't have a ton of time for open discussion, but this is a good segue for each of you to do your own work and to begin to recognize that it can just come from us as an individual, but we really have to work collectively to begin these conversations and to really disrupt this system that we all breathe in on a day-to-day basis. I know we only have like a minute left, but I can open it up for, you can more than welcome to put anything in the comment box that you have, and we can go from there. But I really appreciate each of you taking the time to come together and to talk about race and racism. And I know I'll be doing another webinar talking more about privilege and the privileges that we have and being able to recognize our status in society. Then that will be next Thursday, July 9th at noon. But I also, like I mentioned, I really appreciate each of you taking the time to talk more about this issue. And you have homework with just being able to go out into the world and help disrupt the system. And I can definitely just stick around for a few minutes if anyone wants to put anything else in the chat box that I may have missed, or if you're looking for another resource.
Looks like Brandon is looking for some advice on how young people can talk to older racist family members about the issues.
Yeah, and I think that's a common concern. I think it's really hard, especially when you're stuck in your own old ways. Like, it's really hard. And when we talk to older family members, we have to recognize the context of how they grew up, and to know that this system didn't just pop out of thin air, but it's so ingrained in how we function, how we think, how we feel, how we act. And it does take a lot of work to dismantle and disrupt that system. And those conversations, they can be very tough. And like you said, there's still people that still believe in the ideology for whatever reason. So it's good to know that we can do our due diligence of just continuing to have these discussions or conversations, but know that that is a common occurrence that we see, like that there's people that are really stuck in their belief system, or they're stuck in their ways.
Thank you so much, Christina, for pulling this together and offering this these webinars for us. We do have 4 more coming up, so we hope to see all of you again.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.